Historically speaking, the church was often quite supportive of the idea of extraterrestrial life. That's just a point-blank historical fact. Historically, how did it come to this? I mean, how did we get to this position where the church really does not want to entertain this question? The reason I ask this is because it didn't used to be this way. Now, the debate over whether intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe, again, just departing from all the demonic stuff, the abduction stuff, you might be thinking, well, you can't really depart from that. Again, just for the sake of the discussion is why we're doing it. But the question of whether there are other worlds is actually very old. It goes all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. It has a long heritage. They were opponents, though, to the idea. They didn't like the idea that there were other worlds, and most early Christian authors were also generally opposed to extraterrestrials since they tended to use Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy in the articulation of their theology, the explanation of different theological concepts. Augustine of Hippo, this is the famous St. Augustine, also attacked the idea, and much later Aquinas was opposed to the idea, mainly because he didn't like Aristotle. Later on, though, when you get into the High Middle Ages, in 1277, Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, issued, now catch this, he issued a condemnation of doctrines that seemed to limit God's omnipotence. So he actually produced a list that, if you believe this idea, okay, or if you reject this idea, you're limiting God's omnipotence. And on that list was this. One of the propositions condemned was, quote, that the first cause, God, since he brought everything into creation, the first cause cannot make many worlds. If you affirmed this, if you believed that God could not make any worlds, Tempier was saying your idea should be condemned because you're limiting God's omnipotence. Omnipotence is the idea that God can do anything that he wants that's consistent with his own nature and his will. So here you have a bishop of Paris saying, you really need to believe this because he could have done it. Now, theologians who followed the lead of Tempier didn't argue that God did create other worlds. Some did, some didn't, but the question was only that he could. So they're opening the door to a positive view of this. That openness led to the introduction of what Christian philosophers would later call the principle of plenitude during the Renaissance. So, a century or so later. This was a philosophical, theological idea, not a biblical one. I mean, you're not going to get this from a Bible verse. But it was a theological idea that posited that an omnipotent creator like that proposed in the Bible must, and here's the key difference, must of necessity bring to be all that is possible to fully honor his own goodness and power. Hence, Christian theology went from seeing other worlds as possible to argue that they might even be necessary for God to really, show how great he was. So that became a workable idea. Nicholas of Cusa, a famous figure in church history, encouraged the idea, and he advocated in print that not only could there be a plurality of worlds, but life probably also existed on the moon and the sun. Nicholas was a priest, later became a cardinal, and he was the first prominent Latin Christian scholar to embrace the idea of extraterrestrial life. And he wasn't the only one. Now, later on during the Reformation, the principle of plenitude did face some opposition again, particularly from Melanchthon, who was a Lutheran reformer, who in 1550 warned that the Copernican cosmology would lead to the idea that Christ's incarnation and redemption could have occurred on another planet. Now, what that means is that if we have all these other planets out there that are populated, if we affirm this, then we might also have to affirm that God could have sent Jesus to a different planet and effected the atonement for them and perhaps not us. Or later on, this idea is going to be blown up into the, I'll just call it what it is, into the pseudo-theological problem that if there are other worlds, then Jesus has to be incarnated on every one of them and live and die on every one of them and resurrect on every one of them. That's going to become an objection to the idea of extraterrestrial life. But Melanchthon was more or less concerned about humanity losing its position as the redeemed, or as the target of redemption more properly, than somebody else. So he was opposed to the idea. Belief in extraterrestrials among Christians and Christian theologians continued to be quite prominent during the Enlightenment, 17th and 18th century. Near the end of the 18th century, the consensus within and without the church, people in the church and people who had nothing to do with the church, was that the universe was teeming with intelligent life. And so many Christians believed the possibility actually enhanced one's religious perspective, again, in light of the principle of plenitude. So it was cool, it was in vogue, it was permissible, it was allowable to believe in other worlds as a Christian at this time. The acceptance of extraterrestrial life among Christians was soon undermined, however, by one of the Enlightenment's major figures. Thomas Paine, again, we've heard of Thomas Paine from history class in The Age of Reason. He argued that astronomical science had made it impossible for any thinking person to accept the central Christian notions of a divine incarnation and redeemer. And in the course of this debate, Paine became a firm deist. In his own words, here's how he put the problem as he perceived it. He says, "From whence could arise the strange conceit that the Almighty should come to die in our world because, they say, one man and one woman had eaten an apple? And on the other hand, are we to suppose that every world in the boundless creation had an Eve, an apple, a serpent, and a Redeemer?" He's saying, look, if this is true, and if the Christian doctrines are true, and if it's true that there are other worlds, wouldn't this whole thing, this whole atonement idea, the whole fall and redemption idea, and the incarnation that Christianity has as its central beliefs, wouldn't that have to be repeated on every world that existed? Or else they wouldn't be redeemed. The Son of God would have nothing else to do than to travel from world to world in an endless succession of death with scarcely a momentary interval of life. There's so many worlds out there, you just have to go somewhere and just die all the time. So he thought it was absurd. Numerous Christian authors in the period after Paine responded to his polemics. Two of the most successful were Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University during these dates, and Thomas Chalmers was a famous Scottish preacher. So they just thought Paine was out to lunch and that the idea of extraterrestrial life was just fine within Christianity. And Dwight and Chalmers, by the way, these were major theological figures. These were not hacks, okay? These were not people who didn't know theology. They were among the leaders in Christian theology at the time. And they thought it was just fine. They just didn't buy what Paine was saying. A support for the idea of extraterrestrial life continued through the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the church, but it soon became the threat that many Christians see to it today, and that was really because of Darwinism. With the advent of Darwinism, Christians who took the Bible's claim of a divine creator seriously began to view scientists as the enemy. Okay, that was one of the key intellectual movements or changes that has led to the situation as it is now. Once Darwinists came to the conclusion that the discovery of extraterrestrial life would amount to added support for naturalistic evolution against the idea of a creator, the church became increasingly hostile toward the idea. So the fact that non-Christian secular scientists linked the idea of, hey, if we discover extraterrestrial life out there somewhere, then that supports evolution, because life would have had to evolve somewhere else. That linkage, which I'm going to tell you right now is not logically necessary at all, but that linkage really troubled a lot of people in the church. So they began to be predisposed against the idea of extraterrestrial life. Now, some observations. Historically speaking, the church was often quite supportive of the idea of extraterrestrial life. That's just a point-blank historical fact. The idea of extraterrestrial life did raise important theological questions, but these questions were not viewed as threats to the faith by many. Two things, I believe, drove the church away from the extraterrestrial question, and here's the important part, neither of which arose from the Bible itself. And they were manufactured pseudo-theological problems from enemies like Paine, and the logically unnecessary linkage of naturalistic random evolutionary theory to the question itself. Now, the former of these, Paine's argument about Jesus having to die and resurrect on every world, made Christians wonder if the extraterrestrial life was a problem, and the latter, the whole question of evolution, forced many Christians in their minds to distance themselves from the idea by default, thinking that if we accept this, then somewhere down the road, someone's going to argue that we must accept evolution as well.